can I get you to join us and present your paper? Thank you very much.
Absolutely, with pleasure. It's a real honor to be joining you, to be joining Kamuda today, and it's nice to see some old friends from Malaysia, in particular from the NPC, and Latif, great to join you. Good to see you. I want to present some research that we've been working on for about the last year and a half at the OECD that looks at how governments are developing regulatory frameworks for emerging technologies. So for my first slide, I think it's important to not only think about the digital economy, but to think about kind of emerging technologies more widely. As you can see, we've identified 40 different kinds of technologies in this slide that go beyond just digital to biotechnologies, including, say, synthetic biology, gene drive, to advanced materials, including nanotechnologies, and also many developments in the energy and environmental sector. So there's really a very broad range of technologies that will vastly enhance our lives. Deloitte made some assumptions about what the value of these 40 technologies would be, and in 2030 it would be anywhere between $5 and $15 trillion. So there's this huge opportunities for us. But that, as citizens within a society and also for the economy and these technologies. But if I can get my next slide, but I think with any opportunity also comes considerable challenges. Could I get the next slide, please? In those challenges, we've identified 5 of them. Maybe if I can follow on my slides. Can I share the presentation from my side? Okay, there we go. Thank you. So, like I say, we've identified 5 risks or regulatory challenges, and they're illustrated here. I'll go through each one of these individually. If I can get the next slide, please. The first one is around the pacing problem. Mike Zuckerberg in the mid-2000s coined this very famous term that sort of described the digital era. He called it move fast and break things. He left out becoming a monopolist. But I think those 3 things, move fast, breaking things, and the problem with natural monopolies are the first of the 3 challenges. The pacing problem basically describes the fact that technological developments are much more quick than government's ability to devise regulatory frameworks. When you think of some of these new technologies, they scale within 2 or 3 years. And to develop a robust regulatory framework might take easily, 3 or 4 or 5 years. So again, these technologies are moving much faster than regulators' ability to come up with robust regulatory frameworks. And I think some of the risks here are around regulatory failure. The consequences of some of these technologies, the consequences that pose on society are very considerable. If you take the example of gene editing and gene drive, again, these are technologies that really can fundamentally change life on Earth, our life as a species, and obviously the cost of failure is quite high. There's also the issue around the fact that any potential regulatory failure would have considerable consequences around the globe. It's not just within one jurisdiction. So again, I'll come to this later, but we do need to have a very linked-up response to addressing this pacing challenge. If I could get the next slide. The other thing are these disruptive business models. So many of these technologies significantly and drastically alter markets, and they pose considerable challenges for incumbent firms and regulators. I think Uber is probably the best example here. It's basically a whole new business model around personal mobility that completely circumvented the traditional taxi industry. Obviously, many of these disruptive business models have considerable consumer benefit. Again, a number of studies on Uber show that it provides consumers with benefits in the billions of dollars. But many of these technologies basically arise because they circumvent existing regulatory regimes. Uber says it's not a taxi company, therefore it's not subject to taxi regulation. And it's basically claiming a carve-out. And that provides potential tension between the traditional incumbents within an industry and these new disruptive business models. And Do you basically scrap the entire regulatory regime and say, yes, Uber, you are subject to no transport regulation per se, or do you put them within a sort of a legacy regulatory regime? So how do you kind of manage this? Again, is quite problematic. And well, I'll present some ideas in terms of how to manage this in a future slide. If I get the next slide, please. Also, for many of these big online platforms, they exhibit very strong natural monopoly characteristics. I mean, if you think of Amazon, if you think of Facebook, if you think of Google, basically they completely dominate the markets that they work in. And from a consumer perspective, that's good. You can get onto Amazon and basically buy any good anywhere in the world. But at the same time, Amazon tends to crowd out all other competitors. I mean, there's a strong winner-takes-all attitude with many of these online platforms, and that provides quite significant challenges for both competition regulators as well as other regulators. It's certainly the case that many regulators, particularly in the European Union, realize that many of these platforms are abusing their dominant position, and there have been some very significant fines imposed on Google, on Facebook, and on others in terms of the fact that they are basically crowding out many of their competitors. It's quite problematic because basically one of the issues that's been very, very relevant is the fact that Facebook, Amazon, many of these other big platforms, they're basically buying up their competitors. I mean, if you think about Facebook buying Instagram, for instance, or Google buying YouTube, they basically are purchasing their competition. And again, regulators aren't really they don't have the foresight in the way that these companies do. So again, huge problems with competition that need to be addressed largely through appropriate regulatory regimes. Next slide. There's also the issue around enforcement. The internet is really a very wondrous invention in that it allows any vendor anywhere in the world to reach any consumer or any individual anywhere in the world with very little in between. So it's very difficult in times to attribute the kind of proper responsibilities for potential harm between these end users. I think probably the first example where this was proven to be was around intellectual property. So if you remember these issues around file sharing, like many of you might remember something called Napster, where you could basically share you could share music with people, and it completely got around the people who owned the intellectual property to that music. Think about Facebook as well. Facebook basically is providing a news feed for us, but it claims that it's not a media company. So how do you regulate someone when they claim that they're not subject to a particular regulatory regime? Again, so finding the appropriate enforcement mechanisms in the digital era is extremely challenging. And again, this needs to be thought through quite a bit more carefully. Next slide, please. And then finally, it's basically the domestic and the transboundary challenges of the digital era. Many of these emerging technologies basically they go beyond the remit of any individual regulator. I mean, think about banking over your phone. Is this the responsibility of the financial sector regulator or the telecoms regulator or others? So again, many countries are actually thinking about creating like a ministry for digitalization, which would basically try to capture many of these digital emerging technologies under one remit. Also, it's important to recognize that in many cases, domestic regulation alone is not sufficient to address societal risks in the digital economy. You can imagine a good example was around online gambling. This was very, very limited in New Zealand, but through the internet, punters in New Zealand could access gambling services in other jurisdictions. So how could New Zealand basically enforce its regulatory regime on online gambling if it didn't have cooperation with other jurisdictions? So it needs to be linked up. This is clearly seen through this idea it's called scale without mass, in that any online company can penetrate national markets in a very, very significant way without having a domestic presence, if you will. They have a very small jurisdictional footprint. And also it's the case that in many situations there's what we call forum shopping. So basically, since you can reach any individual anywhere through the internet, you might choose to reside in a jurisdiction that has the lowest regulatory standards. I mean, this was seen very clearly around tax policy with Ireland. Many of the really big online platform companies were located in Ireland, basically to do activity across the European Union because Ireland had very, very low domestic taxes. So again, a number of challenges that we all face. But I think next slide, please. And so I'd like to turn to how the different kinds of regulatory regimes that you have. And again, here I think the title of this presentation is Agile Regulation. I think it's important to recognize the fact that regulators have a very, very rich toolkit in terms of what they can do to try to address these challenges. And I've mapped out some of those here. And I'll go through them very quickly. But I think it's also important to remember that there are a number of non-regulatory approaches that you can use, particularly around information campaigns, market instruments, and so forth and so on. If I could get the next slide. Some of the most interesting developments, particularly around the pacing problem, is what's called self-regulation. So this is where there's no government involvement and where actually industry develops codes of practice, some kind of accreditation, some kind of standards. They do this on their own. You see a lot of this in biotechnology. This is all led by science. These scientists have very strong codes of ethics and practice. So they're basically trying to develop, standards that they will follow. Sometimes these self-regulations morph into co-regulation, where there is some government involvement, where the government basically is acknowledging the fact that it's willing to recognize the standards and the practices that industry develops. So there's a very, very light government involvement in this approach, but again, it's strongly led by industry. But again, this needs to be sort of underpinned by this idea of what sometimes is referred to as ethical business regulation, where there's a set of standards that the business themselves wants to address, because they might realize that if they don't do kind of quote-unquote the right thing, that the government might get involved in a much more systematic or deep way. So again, self-regulation, co-regulation, I think is very good for addressing these issues around the pacing problem, because it's very much led by industry, and industry knows what's going on. Next slide, please. The next step are what oftentimes are referred to as regulatory experiments or regulatory sandboxes. This is where the government creates sort of a carve-out from legacy regulation and creates a safe space for new ideas, new products, to let them kind of develop on their own, where they're not going to be subject to a huge amount of regulation. You see a lot of this in the financial sector space, where basically someone might come up with an innovative product, say online payments or international transfers, where they're not a bank. They're not providing the full range of banking services to citizens. They're providing a very, very small service through digital space. So basically the regulator is saying you don't need to be subject to the vast majority of regulation that banks are held to account for. Basically, they develop some regulations around consumer protection and a couple of other things, and just to see how these might develop. So these are quite popular, as I say, like around fintech or in the financial service space. But you see them elsewhere as well. In addition, there's something that's called adaptive regulation, and whereby this is quite actively used with the development of pharmaceuticals, whereby the trials that are run to see whether drugs are safe and efficient might be a little bit eased to bring out products more quickly. You see this quite a bit happening right now in terms of the development of a vaccine for COVID, in that at least in the United States, some of the very rigorous trial standards by the FDA are being relaxed so that these vaccines can be brought to market a little bit more quickly. Next slide, please. I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of traditional regulatory approaches which could, in fact, work quite well to dealing with these technologies. And regulators are quite used to using these kinds of prescriptive or technology-based regulations. This is kind of the classic, you tell industry what to do. Obviously, they're not particularly agile, but in some cases, firms like these because there's no regulatory uncertainty. They know exactly what they're going to be held accountable for. There also are performance-based regulations, again, which at least across OECD countries are quite well known and well used in terms of the regulator specifying what kinds of outcomes they want to see. These are very well suited around environmental regulation, where you're telling firms that they need to have a certain level of water quality or air quality. These types of regulations are pretty well suited to addressing the pacing problem, because then you can tell a regulated firm what you expect them what kinds of outcomes you expect them to see. And then finally, there's what we call management-based regulation, and this is a bit of it's an unusual regulatory approach where it's strongly based on the firm. It involves regulators working very, very closely with certain firms that have very complex operational procedures, and probably the firm has a strong idea about the best risk mitigation approach that would be suitable for them, and therefore the regulator and the firm come up with a risk mitigation strategy together in a way. Again, you see quite a bit of this. They're very prevalent in offshore oil production, where the regulator has to work with the regulated entity to come up with proper approaches. So again, these are all traditional approaches. They've been used quite a bit, but again, I think they can be used probably more actively in the digital and the emerging technology space. Next slide. And finally, one more, please. Just a minute. Thank you. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think the digital economy really challenges domestic regulation, in that it's not possible always to impose your regulatory regime on someone who's providing goods and services from outside your jurisdiction. So again, we see the need for considerable scope for international regulatory cooperation. These can be multilateral or bilateral agreements, or they can be softer, informal cooperation simply by sharing data or by having mutual recognition. And again, there are many examples of this. Probably the standard right now is the regulation within the European Union around protecting digital privacy, the GDPR. Again, this is a standard that's required across the European Union, but there are many others as well. So again, thinking whether or not you need to work with other jurisdictions and how you might sort of line up your regulatory approach is quite important in addressing regulating effectively and efficiently in the 21st century. And my last slide, please. And just some of the takeaways. We've identified 5 of these challenges that I think are quite prevalent in the digital economy. There might be more. Some of these are well understood, and some much less so. I think it's also important to recognize that there are a number of different regulatory approaches, and trying to understand which approach works best for which challenge, I think, is one of the key issues moving forward. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, self-regulation might be one of the ways to address the pacing problem. I think these regulatory sandboxes might be a good way to address disruptive business technologies. But again, there's probably still not quite enough knowledge and experience in terms of understanding how these challenges can be approached through different regulatory solutions. It's also one thing I think it's important to recognize, that there's probably no single approach to address all of the challenges. And you could well imagine a much more dynamic regulatory framework that needs to arrive to tackle these problems. And you can imagine governments probably need to be a little bit more flexible in terms of initially relying on self-regulation, that eventually making its way more formally into the law through perhaps some of those traditional approaches, and ultimately to having much more linked up or international approaches to addressing these. So again, it's our feeling that there'll be a much more dynamic approach to lawmaking moving forward. And finally, we did some reflection on whether or not the good regulatory practices that all countries use to develop laws and regulations, are they actively and creatively used in this environment? And obviously the standard there is regulatory impact analysis, which is an important, though lengthy process. So again, we're wondering how can we make regulatory impact analysis a little bit more fit for purpose in terms of addressing 21st century risks, making it more robust, making it quicker. One issue we think that is extremely important is around consultation. Regulators need to consult much more actively with scientists, with industry, here and now. So again, it's not that a regulator can simply develop a regulatory framework without their consult. There needs to be much more early stage consultation so regulators can understand really what science and industry are doing. And then finally, I think it's really important that we can't basically, once we regulate a certain issue, we just forget about it. We need to make the law and regulations much more living, if you will, and basically evaluate whether the regulatory approach dealing with the new technology is, kind of fit for purpose, whether it's meeting, community standards in terms of protecting citizens from harm. And if not, it needs to change. But don't let the law kind of get stuck. So those are just some of the takeaways from using GRPs more actively in the 21st century. With that, I'll close and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation. It's a very good presentation, a lot of things there. I would like to open the floor to our members here. Anybody have any questions to ask Mr. Nick Malyshev? Anybody has?
Nick, Chua here. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Now, just now you mentioned about self-regulation, okay? And I guess in Malaysia, we have certain government agency actually implemented such thing called disclosure-based regime.
Mm-hmm.
Disclosure-based regime, basically what it means is we set the rules and law clear and transparent to the market player, so then for them to adhere to, right? And well, if they don't adhere to the rules, then it will come with very severe punishment. Okay? In your experience, basically in the OECD country, right, whether your practice the same and also at the same time, how successful it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you touch on a really important facet, and it's basically about what we sometimes refer to as regulatory delivery, or how regulators interact with regulated firms. Most of the focus in many countries is on regulatory design. So, if we write a good regulation, it will take care of whatever problems it aims to address. Whereas we think that's a bit of a shortcoming. Regulators really need to work very carefully with regulated entities to help them understand the law, to help them understand what compliance is, and if they're out of compliance, to understand why. And is it because they didn't fully understand what was expected of them, or are they sort of willfully breaking the law? If it's the latter case, yes, we think a sanctions regime is important, but we think that probably the most important role that regulators need to play is in terms of helping regulated industry understand what the law is and understand why they need to comply with the law. So there needs to be a very proactive role that regulators play in that area. And I think the United Kingdom and the Netherlands are probably the standard bearers in terms of really focusing very carefully on developing good enforcement and inspections activity. So yes, I think that kind of approach can work. but it requires a very, very proactive regulator to tell industry what's expected of them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do you see that is easier to implement this in a developed country as compared to a developing country, because where the level of compliance is deemed to be higher or so-called to be higher in the developed country?
Again, a great question. Obviously many developing countries have very large informal sectors that are basically, sometimes beyond the reach of regulators. But I think, I would assume that informality is the result of a very, very heavy and probably not a particularly appropriate regulatory regime. And obviously, I think it's in the interest of all developing countries to limit the size of the informal economy, to bring those companies and those activities into the formal sector so that they can be taxed, so that consumers can be protected. So I don't think there's anything inherently more difficult in developing countries regarding regulation. It is very clear that small firms have a much harder time complying with regulations than big firms. So obviously in developing countries, small firms oftentimes are micro firms. It might just be one person. And obviously that person would have potentially a very difficult time understanding all of the laws and regulations that they might need to adhere to. So again, developing, maybe tailor-made regulatory regimes for smaller firms would be quite important, so that they, they're not, if you're selling, say, if you're selling food to consumers from a truck, you obviously probably would require a much smaller regulatory footprint than if you're a restaurant. So again, some kind of degradation in terms of the quantity of regulations, I think, would probably help with compliance in around many sectors in developing countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Anybody has any question for Nick? If not, then I would like to ask Nick on these regulatory sandboxes that you discussed. I mean, this is an area where somebody could simulate a regulatory regulation before they introduce into the market. Is that what you mean? Before they introduce it and firm it up as an act, or is that what the sandbox is supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, basically a sandbox creates a separate and lighter regulatory regime for a new firm entering a market where there is a legacy regulation. So there might be a lot of regulation. So, for instance, Uber in many jurisdictions was not subject to all of the regulations that taxi companies were subject to. It basically had a much smaller regulatory requirement, and the same in banking. So basically, it's what might be referred to as a carve-out. So these new incumbents are subject to a much smaller amount of regulation than more traditional firms, because these new firms are providing a new innovative product to the market that probably does not need to be subject to a much bigger regulatory regime.
Okay. During this pandemic, right, a lot of the regulatory issues are actually impeding our business, especially where certain areas of work where you can not do online. For example, you need to submit documents and all that. So to get around this, we are no longer agile. That means we are not adaptable to forget about the emerging technologies we have on digitalization process. That is where our second paper presenter will talk about. Because we feel that even to get onto an electronic system, we have to do away with, we have to all debate and argue over an electronic form. Thereafter, we have to argue over a simple issue like electronic signature and things like that. Because I'm glad that you brought out this regulatory impact assessment, and it's a good way for us to have a private-public discussion and do away with unnecessary. Because today, the youngsters, if you design anything that is regulatory, right, they do not want to have too many rules to deal with their business and their way of life. So we are talking about In fact, reducing unnecessary regulatory burden. That is more suiting to us. For example, like this COVID bill that most countries would like to introduce, and this is where we need to be very agile, quickly adapt to it. How can we prevent each other from suing each other in a business? Because, we are not allowed to use force majeure clauses, things like that. So in this age, we have no time to test even our regulation on the sandbox, whether it works or not. What is your comment on that, Nick, during this period?
Yeah, we've written around these issues. So maybe I can after the meeting I can point you to there's the OECD COVID hub where there are a number of policy papers, and we've written one on how regulatory practices are being used in the current crisis. And it's clear that many countries have suspended a lot of the regulatory disciplines around GRPs, in that laws are being developed without regulatory impact assessment. Many stakeholder consultations are being suspended in the interest of getting things, out, getting laws and regulations out quickly.
Yeah.
My reaction would be twofold. One is that clearly these emergency measures probably need to be sunsetted, just to send the public this message that, we're doing things under extraordinary circumstances, but these extraordinary circumstances will not last forever, and therefore there will be some return to normalcy, and that these measures might then be rolled back. Or if not, clearly these issues around evaluation, once the crisis abates, many of these emergency measures will need to be evaluated to make certain that they are subject to the rule of law, that they don't infringe too much on any kind of personal liberties or on kind of civil protection more generally. So again, I think if you're not going to do an ex-ante impact assessment, you need to do it ex post. There needs to be post-implementation review. That basically someone is going to do an evaluation on these measures at some point in time, and that the government does not get sort of a carte blanche to just do whatever it wants under the name of we're responding to COVID. So basically, there needs to be a review at some point in time.
Yeah, a good point. Thank you for mentioning that paper that you have that you would like to share. Our members can pick it up through NPC on that and onto our website. Thank you very much for sharing that. So, ladies and gentlemen, any other questions or for Mr. Nick Malyshev, who is the head of Regulatory Policy Division of OECD? If it's not, then we would like to flow to the next paper, which is paper number 2 on the roadmap. I would like to thank Nick and your colleagues for coming in early and presenting your paper.